Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the misty streets of Victorian London, but not the kind your textbooks promised you. No shiny lampposts glowing in the fog like a romantic postcard, more like sludge puddles, coughing horses, and the faint aroma of coal smoke mixed with, let's call it, unpleasant surprises. You probably wouldn't last an hour here without wishing for Wi-Fi, a warm shower, and maybe a tetanus shot. Honestly, you wouldn't survive a day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love for you to drop a comment with where and when you're watching. Watching always makes me smile to hear someone in, say, Berlin at midnight or Chicago at 3 a.m. drifting off while I whisper about people who thought arsenic was a fun household ingredient. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air presses damp against your cheeks as you step into the fog. It clings to your hair, your coat, even the little gaps between your fingers. And you realize right away that London fog isn't charming. It's thick, yellowish, more like soup than mist, and it burns the back of your throat as you breathe in. People once called it pea soup fog, which sounds cozy until you remember that pea soup doesn't normally include soot, sulfur, and a dash of horse manure. That's dinner, apparently. You hear wheels clattering on cobblestones, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves, but everything is muffled, swallowed up by the haze. Figures pass like ghosts, their outlines soft, hats tilted low, skirts brushing damp stone. You might imagine Sherlock Holmes striding out of the fog, but really, it's just a tired delivery boy. Jacket too big, carrying a sack of coal that weighs more than he does. Some historians still debate how much the famous fogs were natural and how much was man-made. But standing here, the argument feels pointless. Your lungs are already filing a complaint. There's a myth you've probably heard, that Victorians loved strolling in this romantic mist, courting under lampposts like extras in a period drama. Not exactly. Most Londoners hated it. People lost their way, carriages collided, and once in 1873, a man supposedly disappeared into the fog and was found 3 days later in the wrong part of town, hungry, confused, and very annoyed. So yes, maybe not the candlelit love story you imagined. You squint through the gloom at a woman hurrying past, skirts heavy with damp, bonnet crooked from the drizzle. She clutches a basket covered in cloth. Bread, maybe, or fish. The smell suggests fish, though fresh is not the word you'd use. In moments like this, you almost wish you had DoorDash. But no, your options are limited to the nearest stall, which may or may not poison you. And yet, Victorians believed their food was wholesome because it was local. Local, yes. Edible, debatable. There's another false fact you may have heard, that every Londoner in this period wore fancy clothes. The reality: most people wore whatever they could afford, patched up and passed down. That woman's shawl isn't stylish, it's survival. And if she looks older than her years, it's because the fog and coal dust stained skin the way coffee stains your teeth. Except you can't just buy whitening strips. You simply age in fast forward. Children dart out of the haze, barefoot even in this damp chill. They laugh, tossing pebbles at a stray dog, but their cheeks are hollow, their ribs visible through threadbare shirts. One boy coughs so hard he has to stop, bent double, before spitting onto the street. The myth of the healthy, rosy-cheeked Victorian child is one of those stories people still repeat. Reality: many children barely reached adulthood. They were cheap labor, not symbols of innocence. In fact, A child might earn a penny guiding strangers through the fog, which sounds entrepreneurial until you remember that penny buys half a loaf of stale bread. You tread carefully because the cobblestones are slick, and the gutter running down the middle isn't just water. It carries ash, animal waste, and whatever household waste someone felt like tipping out the window. You've heard the phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater." Well, Victorians sometimes did toss chamber pots straight into the street. Yes, people below were supposed to yell a warning. But imagine forgetting your umbrella that day. There's a man leaning against a lamppost, pipe glowing faintly as he smokes. The glow is warm, inviting even, until you realize the tobacco is mixed with whatever scraps he can afford. The smoke curls up into the fog, merging with the already toxic air, and you wonder how anyone lived past 40. Funny enough, some believed smoking actually protected their lungs against the fog. Imagine your doctor today telling you to pick up a pack of unfiltered cigarettes to fight pollution. A myth so absurd it's almost charming. The bells of St. Paul's toll faintly through the haze, a reminder that time keeps ticking, even when the world feels suspended in mist. People hurry faster, clutching coats tighter, and you notice how every face carries a look of endurance. Life here wasn't about thriving, it was about surviving each day, each breath in air that seemed determined to choke you. Yet, in the strangest twist, this fog became part of London's identity. Painted in novels, etched in art, until foreigners came expecting beauty and got bronchitis. You turn a corner and stumble into a small square where a lamp flickers weakly. Under its halo, a couple huddles close, whispering. Maybe romance isn't completely dead in the smog, or maybe they're just sharing warmth, since coal is expensive and love is free sort of. The myth of Victorian morality would suggest they're simply discussing the weather. But judging by the way her hand lingers on his sleeve, I'd say otherwise. Funny how myths always prefer people to be more boring than they really are. The fog thickens, pressing closer, and you feel the weight of the city's breath. It's oppressive, yes, but also strangely intimate, like London is wrapping its arms around you. A bit too tightly, perhaps, like a relative who doesn't understand personal space. And just when you think you've had enough, you catch the faintest sound, a street fiddler playing a tune. Thin notes cutting through the smog, a reminder that even in the bleakest air, people find ways to make music. And so, as you keep walking, you realize that half the facts you thought you knew about Victorian London, the glamorous clothes, the enchanting fog, the rosy health of its children, were smoke and mirrors, quite literally. The truth is harsher, but somehow more human, more alive. The fog doesn't let up. But through the haze you find yourself stepping toward a doorway painted a peeling green. Above it hangs a swinging wooden sign shaped like a mortar and pestle, which means you've found a Victorian apothecary. And if you're expecting shelves of neat amber bottles and crisp labels like your local pharmacy, you're in for a shock. Inside, it smells like mildew, vinegar, and something sweet gone terribly wrong. A single candle flickers behind the counter, throwing shadows across jars that hold powders, dried plants, and things you would absolutely not want near your mouth. The man behind the counter looks like he hasn't slept since the last coronation. His spectacles are smeared, his apron stained with, let's call it, mystery substances. He greets you like he's about to sell you hope in a bottle, which, in a way, he is. The Victorians adored remedies. The stranger, the better. They didn't have WebMD to convince them they had 17 conditions at once, so instead they trusted a mixture of tradition, rumor, and a little creative marketing. You glance at the jars. One is labeled leeches, and yes, it contains exactly that: fat, glistening creatures waiting for their next appointment. Bleeding a patient was considered the cure for almost everything from headaches to heartbreak. Feeling stressed, they'd slap a leech on your temple, lungs hurting from the fog. A couple more leeches on your chest. The idea was that bad blood needed to be drawn out. Of course, today we know losing blood while you're already weak is not a brilliant medical strategy. Imagine going to urgent care now and being told, "We'll just drain a pint and see if you cheer up." You'd run for the door. And yet, not all of it was complete nonsense. Modern doctors sometimes use leeches after surgeries to improve blood flow. But here's the difference. Now they're sterile, carefully managed, and not scooped out of a jar by a man who smells like turnips. The Victorians had no idea about bacteria. Not really. Germ theory was still being debated in smoky lecture halls, with some physicians insisting disease came from bad air or miasma, rather than microscopic invaders. Some experts fiercely argued about this for decades, which meant ordinary people kept on inhaling camphor fumes and hanging dried herbs in doorways, convinced they were creating protective barriers. On another shelf, you spot small vials labeled arsenic. Yes, the same deadly poison. It was everywhere, in wallpaper, in clothing dyes, even in some face powders. And bizarrely, tiny amounts were sold as health boosters. People swallowed diluted arsenic to improve their complexion, believing a pale glow meant vitality. It's the Victorian version of buying detox teas from Instagram, except instead of an upset stomach, you risked organ failure. Some fashionable women swore by it, their cheeks indeed turning luminous, though that glow was probably their bodies screaming for mercy. There's a tall glass jar filled with what looks like chalky stones. The apothecary explains it's dried ground mummy. Yes, actual mummy, scraped from the remains of long-dead Egyptians and sold as medicine. If that doesn't sound real, I promise you it was. They believed powdered mummy could treat everything from coughs to stomach aches. And here's the kicker. Some historians still argue about whether most of these powders were truly ancient remains or just crushed bones passed off as exotic imports. Either way, you weren't exactly signing up for a wellness retreat. Imagine telling your doctor today you've been snacking on heritage skeletons for health. Benefits. The man reaches for another jar, this one containing opium pills. Ah yes, the Victorian cure-all. Trouble sleeping. Opium, child won't stop crying. Opium syrup, charmingly called Godfrey's cordial. Toothache. More opium. It dulled pain, certainly, but it also addicted half the neighborhood. By the late 19th century, some towns had so many soothed infants that the mortality rate raised alarms. Mothers trusted it because it worked at least for a while. This was the Tylenol of their day, except with a little extra kick that kept you coming back whether you wanted to or not. And then there's mercury. Yes, liquid silver. Doctors prescribed it for syphilis and a variety of ailments. It made gums bleed, teeth loosen, and hair fall out. But hey, it was shiny. Some records describe patients trembling uncontrollably, while being reassured it was all part of the healing process. Today, we warn kids not to touch broken thermometers. Back then, they swallowed mercury and called it therapy. It's the sort of detail that makes you want to hug your modern pharmacist and whisper, "Thank you for antibiotics." There's another oddity you might not have expected: electric therapy. Toward the end of the century, small devices promised to cure headaches, depression, even impotence with a spark or two. The Victorians were fascinated with electricity. It was new, mysterious, almost magical. People willingly strapped contraptions to their heads or slipped their feet onto buzzing plates, convinced tingling meant progress. In a way, it's not so different from those trendy wellness gadgets you see online today, except the Victorians sometimes cranked the voltage high enough to singe hair. Progress hurts, apparently, and through all this, you notice something. The constant search for relief, for something that works, no matter how strange. Victorians didn't trust their bodies to heal unaided. They wanted intervention, quick and visible. Maybe that's not so different from us now, reaching for instant fixes, miracle creams, energy shots. The difference is that we have double-blind trials, FDA approvals, and sterile packaging. They had chalky powders, colorful promises, and a healthy dose of wishful thinking. You step back from the counter, and the apothecary offers you a tonic in a cloudy glass bottle. It's brownish, smells vaguely of licorice and despair, and claims to cure indigestion, fatigue, melancholy. And this is my favorite general weakness of spirit. You can't help but smirk. Imagine if your barista today sold lattes labeled guaranteed to banish existential dread. Honestly, it might sell out. As you leave, the fog swallows you again, and you clutch your coat tighter, relieved that your medicine cabinet back home contains ibuprofen instead of ground-up mummies. You realize how easy it is to laugh at Victorian cures, but then you think about the desperation behind them. People choking in smog, living in cramped rooms, watching children get sick. They weren't stupid, they were hopeful. And sometimes, hope was enough to hand over your last coin for a jar of something mysterious. You keep walking, footsteps echoing on slick stones, wondering how many myths you still carry, even now. Which of today's trusted remedies will future generations look back on and chuckle, shaking their heads the way we do now? It's a humbling thought, one that makes you pull the fog a little closer, like a blanket that smells faintly of coal and secrets. Close your eyes. Imagine London, late 1800s, gas lamps glowing, cobblestones slick with rain, and people drifting past in clothing so dramatic you'd think every street was a theatre stage. This is the Victorian wardrobe myth at its finest. You've probably heard that every lady wafted around in suffocating corsets so tight they cracked ribs, and every gentleman strutted in three-piece suits like human chess pieces. The picture is vivid, but not entirely true. Fashion history has its own fair share of embroidered exaggerations. Let's start with the corset, that infamous villain of the female silhouette. We've been told it was a torture device, something between a medieval rack and a boa constrictor. And yes, some women did lace themselves until fainting was practically an Olympic sport. But the everyday corset, think more posture support than death trap. Imagine today's shapewear, just with a lot more whalebone and less stretchy forgiveness. Modern myths have squeezed this garment tighter than its wearers ever did. Doctors at the time sometimes even prescribed corsets for weak spines, and somehow we still complain about sitting in office chairs too long. Now picture the skirts. You might think every woman swept down the street with a mile-wide crinoline, accidentally knocking over market stalls like a fabric bulldozer. That happens sometimes, Queen. Victoria's own ladies once caused a minor scandal when their enormous skirts trapped them in a doorway like panicked swans. But not every day was a circus of steel hoops. Working-class women often wore simpler layers, practical enough to scrub floors or sell vegetables without getting tangled like a fishing net. The idea that every woman suffered under absurd cages is just another stitch in the embroidered tapestry of myth. A lesser-known curiosity, the Victorian obsession with colours. The moment chemical dyes hit the market in the 1850s, London streets exploded with hues that would make a neon sign jealous. Bright mauves, violent greens, shocking yellows, colours so intense they practically glowed in fog. And here's the unsettling twist. Some of those dyes were toxic. Shields green, for example, contained arsenic. Imagine twirling at a ball while your dress slowly poisoned you. Today, we panic about microplastics in yoga pants, but they were literally glowing, sometimes sickly, in hues that doubled as health hazards. Of course, historians don't entirely agree on how deadly those dyes were. Some argue that only extreme exposure was dangerous, while others whisper about wallpaper and gowns releasing enough poison to make occupants ill. The truth likely lies somewhere in the folds. Subtle and contested, but the allure of a deadly dress remains too delicious a story to abandon. And then there were hats. Victorians loved hats the way modern people love sneakers, status, identity, self-expression. But beneath the feathers and ribbons lurks another awkward fact. The booming hat industry relied heavily on mercury in the felting process. That phrase, mad as a hatter, it wasn't just whimsical nonsense. Hat makers often suffered tremors, hallucinations, and nervous collapse thanks to mercury poisoning. Picture someone crafting the perfect top hat while slowly unraveling inside. And you thought your stressful job was bad. Meanwhile, men's fashion gets painted as eternally stiff. Frock coats, starched collars, pocket watches ticking away like little metronomes of propriety. But not all men were dandies. Sailors, dock workers, and labourers, dressed in sturdy trousers and coarse shirts, the kind of clothing that could survive both rain and reckless pub fights. The idea that every Victorian man was an overdressed statue in black silk is another example of historical exaggeration. Reality was messier, sweatier, more patched at the elbows, and just when you think you've got the whole picture, Victorian fashion throws in another twist. Morning attire. It wasn't just a black dress for a week and then back to business. For widows, it could mean years of enforced gloom, complete with special veils and socially mandated sorrow. Queen Victoria herself famously mourned Prince Albert for the rest of her life, draped in black until her death. That somber image shaped an entire culture's fashion rituals, though in daily life, many women shortened the grieving period or bent the rules. As with all things Victorian, the public narrative was much stricter than the private reality. It's hard not to compare this with modern fashion madness. Today, we debate whether jeans are too millennial and if crop tops will still be in next season. Imagine explaining to a Victorian seamstress that in 2025, people would pay good money for pre-ripped trousers. She'd probably faint, not from her corset, but from laughter. Or picture a gentleman told that sneakers would one day be worn to boardrooms. His monocle would pop off in horror. We laugh at their absurdities, but in truth, fashion has always been a playground of illusion. There's also the subtle matter of hygiene. Victorian gowns often dragged across muddy streets, sweeping up horse manure and city grime. Laundry was labor-intensive, and dresses weren't washed as often as you'd like to believe. The image of spotless white gowns floating in foggy London, more fantasy than fact. Meanwhile, in our time, We toss clothes into machines with scented detergent pods and complain if the cycle takes an hour. You've never been more spoiled. And perhaps the most curious trick of memory, photography. Early photos froze these stiff, serious poses in dark suits and heavy gowns, giving us the impression that Victorians dressed like that all the time. But those were best clothes moments, the equivalent of your LinkedIn profile picture. No one's Instagram is an honest depiction of life today, and Victorian portraits were no more truthful. Their daily attire was far more ordinary than the myth of constant formality suggests. So when you think of Victorian fashion, remember the mix: elegance, discomfort, practicality, poison, and occasional absurdity. They were neither timeless mannequins nor clowns in cages of steel. They were humans, improvising with what they had, balancing dignity and survival in a world harsher than ours. And that's the thread connecting us. The endless dance of looking presentable while quietly wishing for pajamas. So next time you complain that your hoodie doesn't match your shoes, whisper a small thank you. You didn't have to button 30 layers, risk arsenic poisoning, or drag half of London's mud behind you. You're free to wear stretchy pants in public, a luxury no Victorian ever dared to imagine. And of course, once you peel away the fantasy meals and realize bread with chalk wasn't exactly sustaining, the natural question comes: what happened if you couldn't even manage that? You didn't just skip dinner and order late-night pizza, because that wasn't an option. Though imagine explaining 2-for-1 delivery to someone in 1850. They'd think you were promising a miracle. No, in Victorian times, if you truly had nothing, there was one looming solution waiting for you: the workhouse.now. You've probably heard the phrase, maybe through Dickens, maybe through some half-remembered school lesson. The myth is simple. Workhouses were safe shelters where the poor were fed, clothed, and taught the virtues of hard work. Almost like a government-sponsored hostel, neat and charitable. That's the picture painted by polite propaganda of the age. But the truth, much crueler, much grimmer, and far less cozy than any Dickens illustration could ever capture. Step inside one. The first thing that hits you is not warmth, but a kind of institutional chill. Stone walls, echoing corridors, the smell of soap mixed with sweat and boiled gruel. Families who arrived desperate were almost always split apart. Husbands, wives, children, all sent into different wings, rarely allowed to see each other. The idea, we're told, was to discourage dependency. If a workhouse seemed harsh enough, only the truly desperate would enter. Comfort was not on the menu. Survival, barely. The popular story says everyone was given regular meals, shelter, and work. Technically true, if by meal you mean something resembling watery porridge. And by shelter you mean a bed in a drafty hall lined with strangers. The food was so monotonous that complaints were constant, though of course complaining changed nothing. In fact, there were even rules limiting how much talking was allowed at mealtime. Imagine going to a cafeteria where not only is the food terrible, you're forbidden to make sarcastic comments about it. Utter torture. Here's one of those lesser-known realities. Workhouses sometimes doubled as asylums or infirmaries. That meant the elderly, the mentally ill, and children all shared the same walls. Care was minimal, and conditions often shocking. There are accounts of patients strapped to beds for convenience, not treatment. Yet on paper, the reports described provision of medical relief. Historians still argue over whether these institutions were deliberately cruel or just overwhelmed by poverty on an industrial scale. The truth is probably a grim blend of both. And the work itself. It wasn't productive training or uplifting skill building, like the modern myth suggests. No one walked out of a workhouse with a resume and glowing references. Instead, inmates were often assigned the most grinding, pointless tasks. Breaking stones, picking oakum from old rope, scrubbing until knuckles bled. Jobs designed not to help, but to discipline. You weren't learning a trade. You were being broken down. Compare that to today's career development workshops. Imagine a TED Talk. But instead of slides and applause, you're told to shred rope fibers in silence until your hands blister. Not quite LinkedIn material. Another piece of folklore insists workhouses were equalizers, that once inside, all wore the same uniforms, ate the same meals, and shared the same chores. The illusion of fairness. But in reality, distinctions remained. Children were separated from adults. Deserving poor were treated slightly better than those judged idle, and discipline varied from one overseer to another. Some inmates even described kindness from certain wardens, while others left testimony of beatings, humiliation, and degradation. It was less about equality, more about hierarchy enforced through deprivation. What makes this darker is how society justified it. The official line claimed that workhouses protected the poor from starvation, which is technically true, but at the same time, they were deliberately designed to be worse than any alternative, so that only the most desperate would choose them. You could scrape by on charity, street labor, or petty crime, and many tried those paths because entering the workhouse was seen as an admission of utter failure. The stigma was immense, so much so that people sometimes chose literal starvation outside rather than the institutional starvation within. And here's the quietly debated piece. Not all workhouses were identical. Some records suggest certain towns ran them with more humanity, offering schooling for children or modest healthcare. But others were so notorious that even contemporaries wrote scathing The truth varied, which makes it harder to sum up neatly. Some Victorians insisted the system was necessary discipline. Others decried it as legalized cruelty. Historians, to this day, still disagree whether the workhouse was primarily a failed safety net or a deliberately punitive machine. Let's compare again to now. Think about how we talk about social programs, unemployment benefits, or housing assistance. Even today, debates rage about whether such systems encourage laziness or provide essential lifelines. The Victorians didn't invent that argument. They just institutionalized it with stone walls and porridge bowls. You, at least, can fill out a form online without being separated from your family and assigned to pick oakum for hours. Progress isn't perfect, but compared to that, it's practically luxurious. One of the strangest myths about workhouses is that they somehow built character. That the discipline, the routine, the hardship forged resilience. Maybe in some cases it did. But resilience born from misery is not the same as opportunity. People left workhouses weaker, sicker, and often stigmatized, with fewer chances than before. The character they built was mostly scars, and scars don't pay rent. Picture yourself lying in one of those dormitories, thin blanket pulled tight, belly not quite full, listening to coughs echo through the dark. Now picture yourself in your bed tonight, perhaps annoyed that your pillow isn't fluffy enough, or that your streaming service keeps buffering. The contrast is absurd. You don't need a candle stub to read by, or to fear a warden storming in if you whisper too loudly. You can sigh, roll over, and drift toward sleep in peace. So if the myths painted workhouses as sanctuaries, the reality was closer to prisons for the poor. They weren't uplifting, they weren't fair, and they weren't designed to create futures. They were deterrents, pure and simple. And yet, like all history, the truth isn't black and white. Inside those walls were still human moments, friendships formed, scraps of kindness shared, survival against the odds. That, perhaps, is what lingers most. Even in cruelty, people found ways to remain human. And that's the thread I want you to carry with you tonight. You, with your warm blanket, your fridge, your freedom to complain aloud about your meal without punishment. You're living in a world where survival doesn't mean surrendering dignity at a workhouse gate. Treasure that. Whisper a thank you for the life you have. Because once upon a time, people endured chalk bread, corsets, and yes, the cold stone of the workhouse. And you get to fall asleep safe, curious, and strangely lucky. The workhouse doors shut behind you, and the city seems to stretch out like a different kind of prison one, with no walls, only endless shadows. You've heard the whispers. London streets are a stage where danger lurks in every alley, where every step might lead you into the path of a pickpocket, a cut purse, or something even darker. At least, that's the story that survived in novels, penny dreadfuls, and the memories of the frightened middle class. But like all good ghost stories, the truth is far less straightforward and far more curious. Take the popular fear of Whitechapel, for instance. You imagine gas lamps struggling against fog, silhouettes shifting in doorways, and some unfortunate passerby clutching their purse a little tighter. Yes, crimes did happen. Robberies, drunken brawls, and the occasional stabbing, but the sensational stories were often exaggerated by newspapers hungry for readers. Much like today's clickbait headlines, Victorians thrived on being scandalized. A report of a single mugging could swell into a legend of gangs prowling every corner. Still, people didn't invent all those fears out of thin air. One detail often overlooked is how dim lighting truly was. A lamp on the corner might glow faintly, but step 2 streets away and you were walking into near total darkness. It wasn't only criminals you had to worry about. It was open sewers, potholes, and the occasional horse cart barreling down without warning. Falling into a ditch might not sound dramatic, but it could be just as deadly. And then there were the so-called rookeries, densely packed slum, neighborhoods where entire families crammed into single rooms. Outsiders whispered that these were breeding grounds of vice, nests of thieves and murderers. But historians today note that most residents were simply poor workers trying to survive. Yes, petty crime existed, but so did communities that looked out for each other, shared food, and managed to create a sense of belonging in streets the upper classes feared to even mention. Some debates linger. Were these rookeries truly dens of danger, or were they demonized simply because they made the wealthy uncomfortable? The evidence leaves room for both answers. One lesser-known truth: many so-called criminal gangs were little more than groups of teenagers trying to find mischief-singing bawdy songs, jostling passers-by, daring each other to steal apples. Hardly the nightmare of a hardened underworld, though to a Victorian matron it may have felt like the collapse of civilization itself. Think of it as the 19th century version of parents today panicking over TikTok dances. It's not the end of the world, just youth being youth. Of course, there were darker figures too. Highwaymen may have faded by this era, but the city birthed its own urban myths, shadowy murderers, mysterious figures haunting alleyways, and of course, the infamous case of Jack the Ripper. Even then, the panic that gripped London says as much about people's fears as it does about actual crime. For every bloody headline, there were countless evenings where nothing happened at all. Neighbors gossiping at doorsteps, children playing hopscotch, costermongers selling fruit late into the night. Normal life hidden beneath the louder tales. What makes it strangely funny is how these myths persist. Imagine telling a Victorian that in your time, people strolled down city streets while staring at glowing rectangles in their hands, barely noticing anything around them. Pickpockets today would have had a field day, and, in fact, some still do, though instead of cutting purses, they now swipe credit card data. Different tools, same ingenuity. If you listen closely, the city hums, not with constant crime, but with contradictions. The same alley that was said to harbor danger also hosted children chasing hoops and neighbors sharing bread. The tavern where fights sometimes broke out was also the only warm place for many to escape the cold. It's this layering that made London both feared and beloved, a place where myth and reality blurred under the glow of weak gaslight. So, were the streets truly crawling with villains? Or was it all just an elaborate story Victorians told themselves? The answer, like the fog rolling in from the Thames, refuses to stay still. The shadows may look threatening, but they're also just shadows shaped by fear, stretched by rumor, and never quite what they seem. And as you step carefully forward, you can't help but be grateful that your own streets are lit, paved and free of open sewers, though maybe not free of potholes. Some things, after all, never change. Step further from the mist of London's alleys, and suddenly you find yourself confronted, not just with shadowy corners, but with something far grander, the illusion of an empire that seemed to stretch as far as the horizon. In school books, speeches, and even the songs sung in taverns, Britain painted itself as the shining star of civilization, draped in banners of glory. The Union Jack flew high above countenance, and the phrase "the empire on which the sun never sets" rolled proudly from the tongues of politicians. Yet, like those gaslit streets you've just walked through, what glimmered in the daylight was not always what it seemed in the dark. The common event you've likely heard: Queen Victoria celebrating her golden jubilee, streets overflowing with cheering crowds, banners fluttering. The world's most powerful monarch parading through her capital appeared to embody triumph. To those watching, it felt as if the empire truly was unstoppable, a global family bound together under a benevolent crown. But if you could step behind the curtains of those pageants, you'd notice a different set of truths peeking through. Colonies exhausted by extraction, voices silenced, cultures reshaped under the weight of foreign rule. A curious, lesser-known detail lingers in the story of those celebrations. At one Jubilee banquet, representatives from across the empire were invited to dine in London. Some were seated at the far edges of the hall, so distant from the royal presence that they may as well have been back home across the sea. The symbolism was almost too on the nose. Empire as spectacle, but hierarchy unmissable. It's hard not to laugh politely, of course, at the idea of being honored by being placed near the kitchen doors. The contradictions were everywhere. Take the railways, often hailed as proof of Britain's gift of modernity. True, steel tracks stitched together vast lands, but they also stitched them into patterns that served the empire's appetite, moving cotton, tea, or opium rather than local needs. Historians still debate whether these rails symbolized progress or shackles. But what can't be denied is that they were rarely built with the average villager's convenience in mind. If anything, it's like downloading a shiny new app today, only to realize it mostly serves advertisers, not you. Different century, same disappointment. And what of the glory of the Navy, the great fleet said to rule the waves? Sailors themselves often lived on rations of salted beef and hard biscuits, so dry they had to be soaked in ale before they could be chewed. Imagine serving the mightiest empire in the world while gnawing on bread that could double as a building material. Hardly the stuff of noble ballads. It's these smaller, unglamorous details that make the grandeur wobble just a little. Still, it would be unfair to claim it was all smoke and mirrors. The empire did produce networks of exchange goods, ideas, even fashions that reshaped life both abroad and at home. Tea became a household staple. Curry entered English kitchens, and global trade knitted together economies in ways that continue today. Yet those benefits sat alongside exploitation, so sharp it left scars for generations. To admire the teacup without acknowledging the plantation is to sip only half the story. Some myths still cling stubbornly, like ivy on an old wall. The belief that the empire was universally adored, for instance, ignores the countless uprisings, protests, and resistance movements that challenged British rule at nearly every turn. The Sepoy Mutiny, the Zulu Wars, the Irish struggles each told a story of defiance that rarely made it into the triumphant parades. And yet, in schoolrooms of the time, children were taught a version so polished you could almost see your reflection in it. Perhaps not unlike how modern advertisements still promise perfection while leaving out the messy fine print. It's easy to imagine Londoners strolling past monuments, hearing brass bands, and believing wholeheartedly in their nation's greatness. But there were always murmurs in the background, workers questioning why their labor funded distant conquests, reformers pointing out injustices, colonized voices demanding to be heard. The debates then echo into the present. Was the empire a civilizing mission, as many Victorians believed, or was it a gilded facade concealing extraction and control? The answer depends on which street corner, or which colony, you choose to listen to. What makes the illusion so striking is its persistence. Even now, echoes of that grandeur linger in architecture, in museums brimming with artifacts, in nostalgic stories of the good old days. Yet when you walk through those museums and see treasures taken from faraway lands, the shine takes on a different tone. That glitter isn't always gold, it can also be the residue of loss. So, as you leave behind the gaslight myths of crime-ridden streets and wander into the empire's glow, you begin to see the pattern, illusions dressed as truths, half-seen realities cloaked in spectacle. The Victorians might have believed their empire was eternal, but history teaches a softer, humbler lesson. Power fades, myths unravel, and the shadows always tell more than the spotlight reveals. And suddenly, you might find yourself grateful to live in a time where empires have given way, at least in part, to voices that demand to be heard more equally. Though, admittedly, the world still has a long way to go. Step away from the flags and fleets, and you'll notice that even in the drawing rooms of empire, myths didn't stop at politics or power. They slipped right into the heart, too. Victorian romance, at least in the way we've inherited it, sounds like a novel written in permanent rose-tinted ink. Chivalrous gentlemen tipping hats, women fainting into waiting arms, marriage as the pinnacle of every girl's dreams. A time of candlelit courtship, poetry whispered under gaslight, and everlasting fidelity. Lovely to picture, yes. But when you peel back the wallpaper, like everything else in that age, you'll find the cracks showing. Take the most common scene you've probably imagined: the young couple walking slowly along a promenade, parasol tilted just so, his gloved hand carrying her book of poetry. It's an image reprinted endlessly in art, literature, and film. But here's the twist: most Victorians didn't have the leisure for such strolls. Courtship, for the vast majority, wasn't all sighs and flowers. It was bargaining, negotiations, sometimes even survival strategy. Families weighed income, social standing, and reputation far more heavily than sonnets. To put it bluntly, love letters were often less "I adore you" and more "Can you keep me from starving?" And here's a curious little fact that doesn't always make it into those sepia-tinted stories. Many working-class couples didn't marry until they were sure they could afford to set up a home, which often meant years of waiting or simply living together without the paperwork. Shocking, right? Yet it happened often enough that church authorities worried about irregular unions. Today we'd call it cohabitation, but back then it was scandalous, whispered about behind closed doors. Historians still gently argue whether Victorians were stricter in public and looser in private, or if that's our modern wishful thinking projected backward. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Consider also the angel in the house, that idealized vision of the devoted, pure wife waiting by the fireside, her entire being devoted to her husband and children. It was recited in poems and sermons, but reality often laughed in its face. Many women worked outside the home, not out of passion but necessity, sewing until their fingers bled, scrubbing laundry in freezing water, or even running small shops. Imagine being told you're an angel while carrying coal buckets up narrow stairs. If that's angelic, then surely heaven smells like soot. Meanwhile, men, those paragons of honor, were not all reading sonnets by moonlight. The city teemed with brothels, and while moralists wagged fingers in newspapers, business boomed. The contradiction was staggering. Society demanded purity in wives, but winked at double standards in husbands. We laugh at Victorian hypocrisy now, but are dating apps today truly that much clearer? Swipe right for sincerity, swipe left for convenience. Different tools, same confusion. And if you thought the Victorians were prudish about affection, here's another layer of surprise. Couples did kiss in public, though often discreetly. Some even wrote letters filled with descriptions that would make your grandmother blush. We inherit this idea of stiff collars and buttoned-up restraint, but behind closed doors, passion was not absent. The truth is messier, funnier, and much more human than the stiff portraits suggest. Of course, the rituals of love were tangled with class. Aristocratic weddings could be lavish affairs, staged as much for political alliance as personal affection. Dowries exchanged hands, titles were preserved, and ballrooms shimmered with silk. But even among the elite, gossip churned. Who married for money, who for scandal, who secretly despised their gilded cages. Some celebrated unions were more performance than partnership. And here, again, scholars still circle the debate: were Victorians trapped by their conventions, or did they quietly find ways to bend them? The fascination with mourning, too, had romantic undertones. When Prince Albert died, Queen Victoria draped herself in black for decades, turning grief into a symbol of undying devotion. To some, this was the height of love eternal, loyal, almost sacred. To others, it was obsession, even political theatre. Was it genuine heartbreak, or did the Queen use her mourning as a tool of power? The whispers then mirror the debates now. leaving the truth hazy. You can almost imagine ordinary couples rolling their eyes at such spectacles. They had their own challenges: too many children, too little money, illnesses that snatched loved ones early. For them, romance wasn't in poetry, but in shared survival. A wife tucking bread crusts aside for her husband. A husband working late to spare his partner's hands another shift. Love was less about swoons and more about endurance. Perhaps less cinematic, but in its own way, far deeper. And here's the gentle punchline. While we like to imagine the Victorians as either paragons of morality or hypocrites drowning in repression, the truth is, they were neither exclusively. They were people as messy and contradictory as we are. Their myths of romance were no more perfect than ours, just packaged in lace and waistcoats, rather than hashtags and filtered photos. So when you think of Victorian love, don't picture a flawless waltz under chandeliers. Picture instead the laughter in crowded kitchens, the arguments on damp stairwells, the whispered promises in alleys lit by flickering gas lamps. Picture love as practical, flawed, and yet still tender. And maybe let that thought nudge you into gratitude. Today, you have the luxury of choosing partners out of affection rather than strictly out of financial survival. You have the chance to match ideals with reality in ways many Victorians could not. That freedom, imperfect as it may be, is worth cherishing. Step out of the gaslit parlor where love was recited like scripture, and you find yourself smack in the middle of another myth Victorians adored. That word shimmered like a polished brass handle on a factory door, gleaming with promise, cold to the touch. To walk the streets of London then was to be told, again and again, that the world was racing forward, railways screaming across the countryside, telegraphs stitching continents together, iron bridges defying rivers. If you believed the speeches and pamphlets, humanity was on an unstoppable march toward perfection. Yet, if you were one of the thousands coughing black soot into handkerchiefs, you might have wondered if progress just meant a shinier way to choke. The trains were the crown jewels of industrial pride. They shrank journeys from days to hours, slicing through fields where sheep blinked in confusion at steam and sparks. But the celebrated railway mania also swallowed fortunes in speculation, crushed farmland, and terrified ordinary folk who thought traveling at 30 miles per hour might actually liquefy their organs. Some newspapers insisted the speed would warp the human mind. Today we laugh, while we casually strap ourselves into metal tubes that hurtle 600 miles an hour above the clouds. Still, if you've ever sat in coach class between two crying babies, you might argue Victorians weren't entirely wrong to fear damage to the human psyche. Factories were hailed as cathedrals of advancement, glowing with innovation. Politicians bragged about the machines that could spin, stamp, and shape faster than any set of human hands. But step inside, and progress felt like a sentence. Deafening clangs filled the air, cotton fibers coated lungs, and children scurried under gears to fetch dropped spindles. We're told this was the inevitable price of modernization. Yet whisper it quietly, some historians note that not all factories were Dickensian nightmares. A few employers did try shorter hours or safer conditions. The debate lingers. Were those exceptions genuine or just well-polished window dressing? The truth, as usual, wobbles in between. Even domestic life wore the costume of advancement. Advertisements promised new contraptions to lighten housework, mechanical ringers, improved stoves, even the magical flush toilet. But flush too confidently, and you risked the Thames sending the favor right back into your basement. Progress had a way of selling itself like a miracle while quietly ignoring the sewage gurgling underfoot. If you've ever bought a gadget online that promised to change your life and then ended up as clutter under the sink, congratulations, you've repeated the Victorian experience. And let's not forget the exhibitions, the Great Exhibition of 1851. A glass palace shimmering with inventions, hailed as the Temple of Progress. People queued to gape at giant machines, exotic goods, and even a novelty like the world's largest diamond. Yet tucked behind the dazzling displays, visitors conveniently ignored the labor that mine shipped and assembled it all. Workers overseas bent under the weight of empire's demands, while Londoners congratulated themselves on enlightenment. That glass roof glittered, but underneath it, shadows grew. Here's a detail you might not know. Progress wasn't just measured in machines. The Victorians believed strongly in phrenology, the science of reading character by the bumps on a skull. Imagine being told you were destined for greatness because your forehead had the right slope, or doomed because the back of your head bulged suspiciously. It sounds laughable now, like getting life advice from a TikTok filter, but plenty of respectable gentlemen swore by it. Some even argued it was the future of education and hiring. The fact that people genuinely trusted skull measurements as a path to progress is both hilarious and unsettling. Medicine, too, wore the banner of advancement while dragging its feet through superstition. Anesthesia and antiseptics did change surgery from sheer torture into something survivable. But bleeding patients with leeches, dosing them with mercury, or prescribing opium for everything from coughs to cranky baby zoes, advances aged poorly. Picture walking into a Victorian pharmacy, shelves lined with colorful bottles, each promising relief, half of them hiding poison. To be fair, today we scroll WebMD, convince ourselves we have 6 incurable diseases, and still take whatever over-the-counter pill promises the quickest fix. Maybe not so different after all. And here's the kicker. Victorians themselves sometimes doubted their own narrative. Beneath the grand speeches, journals carried anxious essays about machines replacing workers. Cities growing too fast, moral decay spreading with industrial smoke. Progress, they whispered, might not be as steady as it looked. Historians still puzzle over how sincere those doubts were. They genuine fears, or polite theatre, before charging ahead anyway. The ambiguity lingers like a foghorn echoing through time. But what makes it oddly comforting, as you drift through this maze of contradictions, is realizing how human it all is. People wanted to believe in a brighter tomorrow, even when soot blackened their collars. They wanted to feel they were racing ahead, even while stuck in cramped tenements. Doesn't that sound familiar? We scroll through headlines about AI breakthroughs and space tourism, but still complain when the Wi-Fi drops. Progress is both dazzling and disappointing, then and now. So perhaps the lesson, whispered through the gears and gaslights, is simple. Be grateful for your comfortable heated homes, clean water, medicine that doesn't involve swallowing arsenic. But also hold progress lightly, knowing it often arrives half-baked, dressed up more for show than substance. Maybe that's why the Victorians clung to their myths of advancement. It soothed them, just as we soothe ourselves now with stories of smarter gadgets and better tomorrows. And as you settle deeper into the quiet, let the rhythm of that paradox hum softly. Progress shines, but it always leaves a shadow. Appreciating what you have in this very moment, warmth, rest, the simple gift of breath, that might be the truest advancement of all. You close your eyes, and here we are, drifting into what Victorians might have called the theatre of dreams. though honestly, their stagehands weren't very good. You, lying down, ready to rest, while outside carriages clatter, coal smoke lingers, and someone is shouting about onions at 2 in the morning. Yes, that happened more than you think. But in this twilight space, things unravel slowly, like threads pulled from a too-cheap blanket. Take, for instance, the great exhibitions of the age-grand halls of iron and glass showing off steam engines and exotic trinkets. People queued for hours just to gawk at a lump of coal displayed like a crown jewel. Imagine standing in line, waiting politely, just to whisper, "Wow, rock." Meanwhile, you scroll endlessly today at 3 a.m. through pictures of cats in sweaters. Different century, same strange urge, marveling at the unnecessary. And then there's the whisper that Victorians sometimes drank vinegar water because they believed it kept them slim. A little sour sip before bed, supposedly elegant. Compare that with your modern detox teas that promise to flush away sins. Same ritual, new branding, though at least you can put yours in a pastel-colored bottle and post it online. Now, not everything was so neat. There are rumors, carefully tucked into dusty records, about a circus elephant that was paraded through London streets in a fancy bonnet. Some insist it never happened, others swear their grattant saw it herself. Historians still circle politely, debating whether this bonneted elephant was truth, mistake, or simply a joke stretched across generations. You can picture it though, can't you? Lumbering through the fog, umbrella clipped to its trunk, the crowd whispering in delight. It's oddly comforting to imagine that. Even if it's completely fabricated, here's another twist of absurdity. People once swore that arsenic green wallpaper glowed beautifully by lamplight, which it did. The little detail they overlooked was that it also slowly poisoned anyone sitting too close. Yet families still dined beneath those walls, proudly showing guests the sheen. Today, of course, you just worry about whether your paint color looks better in natural light or warm. Let at least your walls don't try to murder you. Progress in its quiet way. The city streets of that age offered their own theater. You'd step outside, and the cobblestones practically argued back under your boots. Horses barked, horses dropped gifts nobody wanted, and children darted about, half wild with laughter or hunger. A common scene, ordinary then, extraordinary now. Try picturing yourself navigating that chaos while also balancing a plate of oysters. Because yes, street oysters were a working class staple, eaten with hands still blackened by factory soot. Picture it. A whole oyster dinner sold for pennies. The shells tossed into gutters like confetti. Not exactly Michelin stars, but tucked inside the noise, there were stranger practices, ones rarely spoken of today. People believed that placing a slice of raw beef against their face might cure skin blemishes. Imagine standing in your cramped little room, meat dripping, while a flatmate knocks on the door asking if you've borrowed their soap again. Somewhere between medicine and dinner preparation, these routines blur. Strange, yes, but not so far from today's avocado face masks, except yours at least smell better, usually, and oh, the whispered debates that still drift through scholarly halls. Did Queen Victoria really disapprove of women riding bicycles because it seemed improper? Some claim she chuckled at the idea, others say she never mentioned it at all. But the story lives on, stitched into the fabric of curiosity. It reveals something about how we cling to anecdotes, even doubtful ones, because they give us a glimpse of personality in a sea of stiff portraits. What's remarkable is how often the Victorians appear both distant and familiar. They carried umbrellas the way you carry smartphones, clutched tightly, wielded with purpose, sometimes forgotten in restaurants. They craved novelty, gossip, and an escape from routine. You, centuries later, sit with earbuds in, lulled by these wandering tales, not so different in your need for distraction. And here's where the unraveling turns inward. You realize that so much of what survives, whether arsenic wallpaper, vinegar water, oysters by the dozen, or maybe an elephant in a bonnet coat, with equal parts comedy and caution, fake facts, half-truths, exaggerated whispers, all weaving into history's lullaby. What matters is not whether they are completely accurate, but that they remind you how lucky you are now. You don't have to dodge chamber pots dropped from upstairs windows just to get home. You don't have to sit politely while wallpaper tries to poison you. You don't have to drink vinegar to be considered fashionable. Instead, you can lie here, breathing steadily, your world softer, safer, cleaner. The noise outside is traffic, yes, but no horse will startle you at dawn. The light in your room glows without smoke. The sheets don't carry coal dust. Every tiny comfort, once impossible, now rests casually at your fingertips. So let the absurdities of the past hum around you like distant echoes, amusing but harmless. Let the fakest facts dissolve into harmony. Let the little debates and forgotten rituals soothe you, not with certainty, but with curiosity. You are here, present, cushioned in a life that would have seemed luxurious beyond measure to those tired, soot-covered Londoners. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. Feel the calm. You are not walking through fog. Tonight you are resting, warm, safe. Every oddity of history is just a reminder. The present, for all its flaws, is a gift you get to keep. And now, gently, as threads of the past unravel, so too do your thoughts, until only silence remains. Drift there, stay, sleep,